Hello everyone, this is Jotto and welcome to the Hearthstone Weekly Show. Now for this week we have a new / old deck. Now some of you might remember the BK Buffet, which was actually around when Versus Series started, which was almost a year ago. So this is an old deck that I have revived for the next metagame because I feel as if the current metagame is actually very well suited to this kind of deck. So what is this deck? Now, I call it the BK Buffet, also known as the Black Knight Buffet, because there's a million taunts in it. Almost everything in this deck is targeted by a Black Knight, and you just overload them if they do have Black Knight. They just can't deal with all the taunts. And this deck is especially good against two types of decks, Hunter and Druid. And what are the two most popular decks right now? At least from what I've been seeing, Hunter and Druid. So Hunter can't deal with all the taunts, and Druid has some serious problems with slower decks. They're running combo, we're running a million taunts, they can't break through it, and then they just lose. That's basically how it works. They can't deal with big threats, and if they can't match your big threats with their big threats, then they lose, and this deck is slower than theirs, so they die. That's basically how that works. So without further ado, let's get started from the top of the list. So we've got the standard ramp core of Innervate and Wild Growth, just helping you get your threats out faster. Then we've got Wrath to deal with anything early, like Knife Jugglers and Mech Warpers and things like that. Now, the other early game stuff we have is Zombie Chow. Now, the Zombie Chow is the aggro stop 1-drop. Basically, needed something for the bottom of the curve, because if you look at the curve, yeah, there's only one 1-drop. So, Zombie Chow is the aggro stop. It kills most 1-drops and 2-drops on its own. It will sometimes kill a 1-drop and a 2-drop, and with the help of your hero power, will easily do so. Or you can Wrath some stuff, and you can kill a lot of things with Zombie Chow and Wrath between them while you're getting your ramp cards online. So very, very good addition. Then we have a bit of a spicy card here with Mark of the Wild. Now, Mark of the Wild is here to make sure that if they silence your taunts, you can taunt them back up again. It also has some ridiculous synergy with Zombie Chow against early game decks, making it into a taunted Yeti. Then we have things like Sylvanas, which become absurd with Mark of the Wild. It's big game hunterable, however, if they big game hunter it, you steal their big game hunter. So not really, and it negates the tempo loss from playing Sylvanas Windrunner. Very good combination in that regard. Besides that, this can also go on things like Keeper of the Grove. So you kill their guy with Keeper, and then you taunt your Keeper, and you suddenly have a Druid of the Claw on the board, and they have to deal with that if they're an aggro deck. So Mark of the Wild, very versatile. Now, I'm not running Black Knight to combo with this, where you play Mark on their guy and then you Black Knight it, because I'm only running one. If I was running two, which I don't think is correct, it's a bit clunky, then I would be running the Black Knight, because then you'll probably get two in your hand at some point. You can just Mark their guy and then Black Knight. But Mark the Wild's already slightly clunky, but it hasn't been to the point when I want to remove it, and it's been winning a few games on its own. So, very good card to add. Big Game Hunter. Pretty much mandatory in the current metagame. Dr. Boom being everywhere, some handlock running around. On top of that, Druid has absolutely no hard removal. So you kind of need the big game hunter to deal with that stuff. On top of that, there is a couple variations of Control Warrior running around, and while the matchup is already favored, having the big game hunter to deal with one of their big threats when they do play them is pretty much necessary. And when you do get big game hunter on their Ragnaros and when you don't, it's night and day. So you really want that big game hunter in this metagame. Then we have Swype to deal with the early threats by killing the big one and then killing all the small ones from collateral damage. You can also use it with your hero power in particular. Same goes for Wrath, by the way. You can use a hero power and it becomes very versatile to do either 5 damage to one guy and 1 to everything else, or 4 to one guy, 2 to some other stuff. In the case of Wrath, you can use it to deal 4 for 4 mana or 2 for 4 mana and draw a card. So some very, very versatile synergies with your hero power and Wrath on Swype. Just being able to sort of put damage on the board in various different ways is very handy. Speaking of putting damage on the board, Keeper of the Grove. One of the single best silences in the game, arguably the best one, because it has a second mode, which most people will be using most of the time, which is deal 2 damage on a 2/4 for 4. It's amazing how good that mode is, the damage mode here, because it will be killing things like Knife Jugglers, Flame Imps, silencing things like Nerubian Eggs, Mad Scientist. These are all very, very high priority targets for the Keeper, and it lets you stabilize while you get the rest of your cards online, because your mid game is going to be pretty secure. On top of that, the silence works on things like Sylvanas and also Savannah Highmane, helping you out against those cards which are traditionally very hard to deal with. Very, very nice to have 2 silences in your deck, and besides Shaman, Druid is the only class that can really get away with this because both of those cards have a damage mode, which means they're not dead if they haven't played any silence targets. Senjin Shieldmaster, the first of the taunts in this particular list, if you don't count Mark of the Wild, of course. Simple, 4 mana 3/5 taunt. Haven't played with Senjin in a while, but I thought I'd break out the Golden Senjins again, which I think I got from Rogue level 60. Someone might correct me on that, but I think it's a Rogue level 60 card. But this is in the deck because of a kind of philosophy, which is that if you have a taunt, it's good. If you have 2 taunts, the second one is better than the first one would have been. If you have a lot of taunts curving into each other, they get exponentially better because you have to invest into killing each one. And eventually your opponent runs out of cards. So this is the beginning of the taunt curve, whereas Ancient of Wool, or War, is the end of the taunt curve. So having 5 health matters. It also has the Sludge Vulture first half stat, so the 3 attack will kill a lot of things like Piloted Shredder. It will kill the first half of Piloted Shredder, which is actually very, very useful. So moving on to Eel Bolt. Now this is in here as a more recent addition. I was originally running Shade of Naxxramas. It wasn't bad, it just didn't do enough because you're not running combos. And Eel Bolt does help you stabilize against mid-range Hunter in particular. Why mid-range Hunter? Because Face Hunter can't get past all the taunts anyway, but mid-range Hunter can sometimes grind you out, and while you have better top decks than they do, sometimes they just kill you before that comes into effect. So you have Eel Bolt and 2 Ancient Allures to try and heal up as much as possible. Very, very good healing card in that regard. It's also a 3/3, which means it's better than, for example, Healing Touch later on in the game. The extra cost does not matter as much. Druid of the Claw along with Sludge Vultures are the 2 5-drop taunts. I wouldn't dream of cutting either one of these in my opinion. Sludge Vulture is the better taunt because it has 7 effective health. But Druid of the Claw is a bit more versatile. Why? Because you can put it in charge mode, which will kill anything with 4 health and usually won't die, and sometimes you just need it to kill something like Thorisand for 7 mana, which always sucks, but sometimes you have to do it. So in the mirror, for example, you'll probably put this in charge some of the time to kill things like Keeper of the Grove, and against Warrior you can use it to kill Armor Smiths for free almost. Whereas in the case of Sludge Vulture, it doesn't really die to hard removal in most cases, with the exception of things like Hex and Polymorph, because everything dies to Hex and Polymorph. Because it has 2 bodies, so if they fireball it, it doesn't matter because it's still a 1/2. So Sludge Vulture is the better taunt, but Druid of the Claw is more versatile. Speaking of 5-drops, we have the man himself, Loretha. Now Loretha, I expected to not be as good in this deck as he is in Combo Druid, for example. In my opinion, he's actually better. I was not expecting this. But basically, you play him as a 5/5, he sticks as a threat, then you kill his guy with the Loretha, and you play a taunt in front of him. Then they have to deal with him with some sort of removal, and then they have to deal with the taunt and more threats. So Loretha disrupts their plan of remove your threats as you play them. And as a result, you play Loretha, then you play more taunts on top of that, and suddenly they have to deal with 2 threats in 1 turn, and that's very hard for a lot of decks to do, so they just lose to the Loretha. So I have beaten a couple of warriors to death with a 5/5. I think my record with Loretha is I hit someone 6 times. That was a warrior, so he had like 44 effective life or something, but I did hit him with Loretha 6 times, and I won the game because of that, because I just kept playing more taunts, and he couldn't hit it with a weapon. And he had to use his executes on the bigger stuff, so he just died to this Loretha. So on to the 6-drops. I'm running 3 6-drops. I'm debating a 4th, but I'm running 3 6-drops at the moment. Emperor Thorisand, the Blackrock Mountain addition to this particular deck. Now the reduced cost is worse in this deck than it is in normal fast druid decks with double combo, because combo works ridiculously well with Emperor. Basically reduces it to 7 cost instead of 9. However, in this deck, the main function of Thorisand is to make your turns 7 and 8 utterly insane, because you can start playing multiple taunts in a turn, and as I said with Loretha earlier, they can usually deal with 1 a turn, but not 2, because you're supposed to be playing on curve. The fact that you can disrupt their kill 1 threat a turn plan with Thorisand and Loretha means that these work in a very similar way in this deck, which is kind of weird because they have completely different effects. But the end result is pretty similar. Now, Thorizan is worse in this deck because later on in the game he's not as bad, he's not as good, but he's still a 5/5. I mean, a 5/5 is still a decent body, and it will help you out with the rest of your top decks. Lets you get KelThuzad down, not a turn earlier, but in addition to something else is the point. So Thorizan's actually pretty good in this deck, just not astonishingly good like he is in some other decks. But pretty good is good enough as far as I'm concerned. Ulta Sylvanas will leave the Sunwalker, the Spicy Edition, to last. Now, Sylvanas is the best of the 6 drops in my opinion in this particular deck, and the main reason for it is because you can negate the tempo loss from Sylvanas in 2 ways. The first being that your taunts absorb most of his extra guys, so when you play Sylvanas, it's in response to a big threat, and he can't just kill you because he's lost all of his small threats in addition to the big one. So then he has to do this weird trading into Sylvanas thing instead of just killing you, which is what will often happen with Sylvanas. The other way of negating the tempo loss besides just a bunch of taunts is by giving Sylvanas taunt with Mark of the Wild. I mentioned this earlier. There's almost no good way past that apart from silence, and if they silence it, then they don't have a silence for Ancient of War or Sunwalker. That's the other reason Sylvanas is better in this deck than in most decks, because they will have to silence a taunt sometimes, or they'll have to silence a taunt at some point, especially Ancient of War. -5 health is a big deal when you silence it. So when you play Sylvanas, they probably won't have a silence for it, and that's kind of brutal on their end. So we usually steal something. Sometimes it will just steal a big game hunter that they use to kill it if you have Mark of the Wild on it. But then that's still fine. You put in 2 cards, they put in 1, but then you get the 4/2 and they have to kill it. So it's everyone's on stable footing there. Sorry, Sunwalker, not Ancient War. Sunwalker is the spicy 6 drop in this particular list. I am debating running 2 of these, but 1 has been pretty good, so I'm sticking with that at the moment for this particular deck. Now, the Sunwalker is one of the most underestimated cards in the game. It does come up every so often. It's astonishingly good against Druid and Hunter. That's the main reason it's in here. Hunters can't get past this thing efficiently. They just can't do it. It's about as hard to get past the Sunwalker as it is in Ancient of War. Because unless they have Unleashed the Hounds, they're not chipping down the shield. They have to use, I think, a Shredder or even sometimes a high main attack to kill the Divine Shield, which is really brutal. And usually it will take a Hunter's Mark and 2 attacks instead of the 1 normally for a taunt, or it'll take an attack and a kill command. That's a huge deal. And a lot of your stuff will get kill commanded, and it kind of sucks, but then you realize those aren't headed for your face, so it's fine. And Sunwalker is one of those kill command absorbing targets. Not running 2 because I feel like it might be a bit too clunky, but there aren't that many 6 drops in this list, so I could definitely see it instead of, for example, the anti-Eel Bolt if the metagame slowed down a bit. So, onto the 7 drops. We're running 4 7 drops. The first 2, well, I guess 2 7 drops, but 2 copies of each. The first 2 are Ancient of Lores. Now, Ancient of Lore is arguably the best Druid card in the game, besides maybe Innervate and Wild Growth. Is that cheating? Maybe. But anyway, so Ancient of Lore is essentially a 5/5 with an Arcane Intellect attached for less mana than you should be paying for that effect. Yep, it's cost 7 mana instead of what would be effectively 8. So 7 mana for this effect is just ridiculous. It really is. The fact that you can play it with Innervate or Wild Growth on turn 6 or 5, or even 4 if you have Innervate and Wild Growth, and then you get your cards back so you don't lose cards from playing Innervate and Wild Growth, is just astonishing. It also has a healing mode. Now, usually you don't want to play the healing mode, but sometimes you have to, needs must, so you play it and you heal yourself, and then suddenly you're not dying anymore. So Ancient Lore has that extra mode. Now, I haven't healed a minion in a very long time. I expect if I played this deck enough, it would eventually come up, probably on an Ancient of War, but I haven't done that in ages, and it almost never comes up. Mostly the healing mode will just be used to save yourself from death, from like a burn spell. Ancient of War, which I referred to as Ancient of Wall earlier, because that's kind of how it works against aggro decks. It's a 7 mana 5/10 with Taunt. It has another mode, but I've never used it. I imagine there is some reason to use it sometimes, but this deck has no big game hunter target, so I don't really see the point, unless you're really scared of Black Knight, but you probably have enough taunts to absorb them anyway. Ancient of War is one of the most effective taunts in the entire game, card advantage wise, because you play it and they have to invest 5 or 6 cards into killing it if they're an aggro deck. If they're a rogue, it kind of sucks because they'll sap it, but then you have a bunch of other taunts which cost less, which they'll probably have to sap anyway. Same thing goes for Shaman, they'll hex it, but then they have a bunch of other hex targets as well, so it gets a bit awkward if they don't. It gets a bit awkward if they save their removal and then they get beaten to death with Sludge Vultures and things like that, but then if they don't save it, they die to an Ancient of War. That's basically how this card works. And I mentioned earlier with Sylvanas that this is a bit of a silence magnet. Both of them are. You have to silence Ancient of Wars and Sylvanas, but then you probably only have one silence in your deck, or two if you're playing Druid or Shaman. However, if you silence one, you can't silence the other one, and then you just lose to the other ones. So Ancient of War, astonishingly good. One of the very underplayed cards in my opinion, probably because the most common version of Druid right now is Double Combo. The last card in the deck is KelThuzad. Now the other spot, the other legendary you can play in the spot is Cenarius. Now I'm not playing Cenarius because, well, quite frankly, I don't have him. But having thought about it a bit more and having played with KelThuzad, I don't even know if Cenarius would be better. KelThuzad has been very good in this list. I've played KelThuzad in a lot of decks before, and he's always been removed because he's just never been that good. But in this list, he's been very, very good. You just keep playing taunts, and then eventually you stabilize, they play something, they're trying to set up to kill your taunt, and then you play KelThuzad, trade your taunt, comes back, and they lose. That's basically how KelThuzad has been performing, and that's why I said earlier with Thoris, you want to play him and then play something else on top, like Wrath to draw off your own taunt. I've done that with Sunwalkers before, where you just hit something that's a 4/4, and then you Wrath your own Sunwalker, draw, and then play KelThuzad, reanimate your Sunwalker. It now has its shield back, and they just pretty much lost the game. So KelThuzad has been absolutely amazing. I would not underestimate this guy. He also does lower the dust budget on this down a bit now that I think about it, because he does come from Naxxramas. So the only actual legendary that you have to craft in this entire deck is Sylvanas, weirdly enough. Even though there are 4 legendaries in this this particular deck. So yeah, KT, don't underestimate him. He's been functioning very well. You have to know when to play him, though. You pretty much have to play him. If you have no threats left, you can play him. But then you really want to play him behind a taunt, because then they just can't get past both and they lose. Now, he does die to hard removal. However, they probably have to use hard removal on your Ancient of Wars. And if they do, then they can't kill the KelThuzad. That's actually what's been giving this deck a positive win rate against a lot of decks with hard removal. Simply because they have to use it against Ancient of Wars and Sunwalkers and things like that. Even Druid of the Claw sometimes. And then you've got Ancient of Lore for card advantage and KelThuzad at the end for massive card advantage if they've already used their hard removal. Speaking of matchups, so this deck has been functioning about 70% win rates so far. Keep in mind it's towards the beginning of the season, so those percentages are not entirely reliable. Simply because you don't know what kind of players you're playing against. There might be people who are actually supposed to be ranked 13 players, and they might be legend players. It's kind of weird how it works in the first week. But anyway, so the good matchups so far have been Warrior and Hunter, obviously. It's also been very good against Mage, because Mirror Entity is good. However, you can beat both, because you just stick an Ancient of War, then you Mirror Entity your 5/5s, the Ancient of War kills the 5/5s. So that's one way of dealing with it. You can also, if you play Thoris, I have done Keeper of the Grove to do something, and then just played Ancient of War after that when I've already popped the Mirror Entity. Then they have a 2/4 and you have a 5/10. So there are ways around Mirror Entity. It's hard, but you can actually get around it. So yeah, Warrior's been favored. Warlock has been hit or miss. Handlock is not that good, which is fair enough, because Taunt Druids are not that good against Handlock in general. But against Zoo, I haven't lost with the deck yet. So pretty much anything aggressive it's very good against, and it's also very good against Druids and Warriors. Bad against Handlock and Rogue, pretty much. Although Rogue I haven't tested enough yet. I've only played 2 or 3 games against Rogues. They just haven't been showing up today, which has been really interesting. But anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, want to ask any questions, put it in the comment section below. I'll put the deck list, and also the write-up for the deck will be on that deck list when it's ready in the description. And I'll be doing a grinding on the ladder of this deck later on today. I'm actually very, very close to Golden Druid. That's one of the reasons I made this deck in the first place. So I'm very close to Golden Druid, so I'm hoping to get it in that video. But anyway, as for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.